My guest today is Ken Mondschein, who is the writer of Game of Thrones and the Medieval Art of War. And he has the on tap kenmondschein.com. Sorry if I screwed that up a little bit. But today we're going to have an interesting episode as a new show Host of the Dragons came out. We're going to discuss parallels in real history that inspired Game of Thrones, as the title of this episode says, because there's a lot of parallels and a lot of really quite a significant lot that is George R. Martin got inspired from the show that casual viewers and not necessarily history buff like myself have thought about. And before we start with that, I want to ask, how did you end up studying the medieval era in the first place?
Everyone asked me that, and it's kind of like my own particular autism, I guess. It's my
Mm,
own particular little obsession. So it's something I've been into since I was a little kid, and sort of organized my life around it.
mm,
So yeah, that's how it came to it. I grew up in New York City, and we had a bunch of medieval museums or museums with medieval art. We had that rich people brought back to the States in the late 19th century to show, that they were as classy as their European um, aristocratic counterparts. And you see it, and it's sort of like something from a world apart. And it's very, very different from my kind of, working class upbringing. And then also it was a bit of escape from, the concrete and asphalt of New York.
mm,
So, yeah, yeah. So been sort of obsessed with that sort of thing since a very young age.
mm. And a lot of people pointed out, both me and I think in general, that there, like you said, there's a lot of parallels to real world history, medieval history, as that is Martin's obsession as well, I think. And we're going to dive into that now. And I wanted, a friend of mine pointed out to me that, the Targaryens, we agreed, pretty much are the Normans, but the first men are kind of the Celts, right? And the Andals in the show is kind of Anglo-Saxons. Is that correct? Is
I
that a
mean,
correct analogy?
yeah, I mean to whatever extent that these are, these labels that we give these ethnic groups are, because this is all like 19th century historiography. And I don't know if, the Picts and the Celtic peoples, and remember they were sort of not they were it's not quite parallels because remember the Celts of Britain had been a Roman colony, and so they were sort of they're Christianized and Romified. But Martin has them as sort of like pagans, in a very romantic sense, and so they've been Christianized and Romanized. But and then these successive waves of invasion clearly inspired, but also kind of fits into sort of neat 19th century ethnogenesis, I think,
Mm,
which is a little inaccurate in some ways.
mm. So let's talk about the Targaryens here, because, like you said, they are Normans, and I really trying to find out. I don't think it was the current series, but his father, or was it grandfather? I'm not quite sure, that he is kind of more or less a William the Conqueror. Is that correct?
Well, that'd be Aegon, right?
Yeah.
Aegon. But of course, it was a very different situation um, between William the because it was actually a succession question, whereas the way Martin framed Aegon's conquest, it was a bunch of different things, and it's almost like more like the conquest of Ireland with client kings and getting like involved in things. But yeah, this was and Black Heron and Harrenhal and all these different things. Um, so it's not quite the same parallel. There's a bit of invented history there, but what's interesting to me about the prequel book, right? The whatever the heck what it's called, so My World of Ice and Fire, um, and it's related material. What really strikes me is that he wrote it to have the sound of a history, that he's got these sort of invented primary sources, various chronicles and accounts and things like that. And that's sort of like how we do history, is we read these primary sources. We read these things, and we read these things, and some are more or less trustworthy, and Martin has his invented Septim Eustace, and then Mushroom, the court jester, who's like almost like a little Procopius, the guy who chronicled somewhat unreliably Justinian Theodore's court back in the 6th century in Byzantium. But he's playing at these sources as sort of unreliable narrators, and so it's a nifty little invention because he's not just inspired by history, but by history writing.
Mm. And that, yeah, it was fascinating. I haven't read the book, the prequel book. I read the first book, but I haven't read the prequel book yet. I plan to, but it's interesting. That's why we have the time jump in the show, right? Because it's written like a chronicle. That explains why we have this time jump in the prequels, right?
Yeah, yeah. This there's that time jump, like in real life, and that's like I find the time jump to be very interesting, too, because it's a risk for the showrunners because okay, they've established these actors as playing these characters, and the question is then can these other actors embody those characters in such a way that it doesn't mess with the suspension of disbelief. So it's a bit of a narrative risk, but it's very interesting because you've got like 5 episodes with the one actors, and then you jump and you got the different actors.
Mm. So what else from the Targaryens can we see that kind of mirrors? We agree that they are more or less the Normans, but is there anything else we kind of can see that they mirror real life?
Yeah, except of course
Counterpart?
the Normans, definitely had more of a central government. There was less leeway for a large, for not entirely, right, but you did have things like roving kings justices and things like that. A little more, I guess, a little more leeway to the various great houses in Westeros, but um the Targaryens. I mean, what's interesting is that the Dance of the Dragons, right, which is the subject of the prequel series of House of the Dragon, that kind of sort of mirrors the 100 Years War. I mean, it's not between two different countries, but the whole thing is set off by a question of can you inherit, well, in real life it was can you inherit through a woman, right? Edward's grandmother, I believe, was the daughter, but there's also there's those questions, and then of course it's essentially a civil war for power, and then of course the War of the Five Kings and the main line of Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones, that is in many ways inspired by the War of the Roses, where you had different contenders for the crown. So certainly, there's a lot of historical inspiration there. Of course, Martin's a big history nerd, but of course, one has to say that this, of course, is not history. History doesn't always resolve into neat little narratives. To be fair, Song of
Yeah.
Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones isn't a neat little narrative, but it is a but it's definitely takes a lot of inspiration. I wonder if the reason why is because certain stories keep recurring, right? Or simply that just the plot twists in history are so just so inherently interesting, and maybe it's the callbacks. Certainly history nerds like enjoy the callbacks, but also um I think you can find a lot of good narrative ideas and a lot of good story ideas in history.
Imagine William the Conqueror riding over Britain with a dragon.
I'm sorry.
Imagine William the Conqueror riding over Britain with a dragon.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
But
definitely William the Conqueror and Aegon, William the Conqueror, Aegon the Conqueror. Certainly they are parallels in some way. And of course, William's conquest of England didn't start off a whole new dating system. And of course, William did not conquer Scotland, which I guess, the North is Scotland, right? It doesn't hold true, but certainly in some ways Westeros is medieval England writ
yeah.
larger.
Yeah, I mean, I have a Game of Thrones risk version myself at home, and when you look at the map, you can clearly see but it does resemble Britain quite a lot in the map, even though and I think it's the same as we look at the map of Westeros and Google, right? It's does really resemble Great Britain.
Yeah, in some ways, right? It's this big mass, but it's bigger. And I think that's just so Anglo-centric, right? In the sense that um for Americans and for British people too, like there's an old British headline, fog and channel, continent cut off, right?
Mm.
And this just like there's nothing but everything is jolly old England, and people are like, oh yes, we're sure there was some French medieval history in there too, but of course you look at all the media, like the French and the Germans and the Italians are just people with funny accents.
Yeah.
So it's a little yeah, it's a little bizarre. So
Mm. But so since the Targaryens again are the Normans, does that technically make the Baratheons slash the Lannisters the Plantagenets in some way?
Plantagenets.
Yeah. Are they
Um
technically the medieval the Game of Thrones version of the Plantagenets? I'm sorry if I said that wrong.
um I mean those came from the Normans. Well, they were the Plantagenets came
Hmm.
from Anjou, right? And they actually took they took over in 1154. So it was actually, you know, not it was actually quite, quite a bit after. Um and he he control he it's not quite the same. I don't think the Plantagenets are the right way of looking at it. I think a better way of looking at it would actually be there was actually before the Hundred Years' War, right?
Hmm.
It was Henry the Fourth, and I think a better way of looking at it would be if you looked at Henry Henry the Fourth of England, Henry Bolingbroke, who they were related, of course, through John of Gaunt to the royal line, but he and so he wasn't completely outside of that, right? But
Yeah.
the Baratheons were, just one of the great houses. Um, but it's more, I think it's more similar to that, and of course, then Henry, then there's Henry the Fifth,
Hmm.
right, and then Henry the Fifth rather popular, and he's succeeded by um you know Henry the Sixth, and then of course when after he dies, then we got Edward the Fourth, and then after Edward the Fourth dies, I'm trying to remember all of them, of course. um and Edward the Fourth came um the question was like, who's gonna succeed, who's going to succeed, Henry the Sixth, and a whole bunch of different things, like the big succession crisis. You don't really, you do have episodes in the War of the Roses where the exiled king he's exiled to France, and he comes back and takes over, right? And this happens in history too. Like there's the after the deposition of James II, there was especially in what do you call them, the Stuart loyalists, right?
Yeah.
What do they call them? Stuart um Jacobins. Jacobins, right? From James, of course, the Jacobins. So I'm sorry, my brain is not. I'm
That's
recently.
fine. Don't worry.
I went through a bit of personal tragedy, and my brain is not firing on all cylinders.
That's fine. Don't worry about it.
So yeah. So that's what happened.
Hmm. So
Anyway.
yeah, and let's talk about because in the beginning of Game of Thrones series, and I haven't, like you said, I haven't read the book of the prequels, so so I can't really talk too much about it, and it would kind of spoilerish as well for the show. So don't want to go too much into the prequels right now. But let's go with the start of the show, and then the Dothraki clan. We talked about this before the recording. We started recording the podcast, and you said I said I have a real mongrel kind of vibe from the Dothraki. Is that
Uh,
am I way
the
off here, or
Mongols.
is it
Yeah.
more or less right?
Yeah. So the Mongols, I mean, he said that, to some degree they're inspired by the Mongols, also by Native Americans, Great Plains Native Americans like the Cheyenne or the Sioux. To some, but I think in a lot of ways the Dothraki and this sort of like, I mean, it's sort of like this romanticized, like ultra-violent society, isn't it? In
Mm,
many ways, I think of them as also inspired by like the Hells Angels or an American biker gang.
mm. Yeah.
They're like almost like a criminal syndicate of Central Essos. So, and there's a lot to that because, of course, and they don't, Martin doesn't really go into the details of Mongol society, which is really interesting. Like the men, yeah, they made war and rode horses and hunted, and shot bows and wrestled, but the women did all the trade and the economic activity, and he doesn't really kind of show that. He makes it such a patriarchal, male dominated society without really looking at how important women and women's economic activity was to that society.
Mm,
So you can't really say, without that, you can't really say, oh yeah, it was based on the Mongols, whereas the Mongols had this very unique social organization.
mm. But it's more or less mongrels, right? The Westeros free or slash free cities game version of the mongrels, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it is kind of Westeros slash the free cities version of the mongrels, though.
Yeah. I mean, very romanticized in many
Mm,
ways.
mm.
So,
And something that I kind of thought about, but I think it was Crassus, the one that faced the Spartan rebellion in ancient time, and a few episodes in the first season, Viserys, Daenerys
Spartacus.
brothers. Pardon?
Spartacus. You mean Spartacus, right?
Yeah, no, Marius Crassus, the one that defeated Spartacus, the
Right, right,
Roman senator, and
right. You
yeah.
said you said Sparta. I wanted to make sure
Yeah, no,
people knew
I
that you
wanted
meant
to make
Sparta,
yeah, no, never mind.
not
Yeah,
actual
but
Sparta in the
yeah,
Peloponnese.
so Viserys, he in the first season, I think it's Viserys as his Daenerys brother. He dies with a drawn when he was stolen crown and the Khal Drogo. He put his
Yeah.
mouth scrolled and he put over his head. Is that a reference to kind of Crush's death? Because he dies in the same way, don't he? He dies with I don't remember who the name of the tribe that does this is the Battle of Carrhae, I think. They pulled melted gold over Crush's face, and he dies that way after is defeated in the battle. I think. Is there a connection here, or
I think it's just like yeah, because he was yeah, his head was like cut off, right?
mm,
He was actually killed in sort of a skirmish, um, right, which were with the Parthians, right?
yeah,
Um, so it's not really that was I don't know, was anyone like actually killed? I mean, it's I'm sure it was actually happened, right?
yeah? I think
Uh,
that there were. I'm pretty sure. I'm not
meat
quite
horse.
sure if it was Crassus though. There was a Roman senator. I remember. I think it was a part. I'm pretty sure it was Crassus. I'm not quite sure. I could be wrong here. You're probably right. But that just a
Manius
melted gold.
Aquilius,
Yeah,
yeah, who Manius Aquilius, right?
yeah,
Um, was killed. He was of course um had that happen to him by Mithridates the sixth of
mm,
Pontus had molten
yeah,
gold. So there was that, right? And then Valerian supposedly was executed that way. But yeah, it sounds good, right? That this sounds just
mm,
really sounds all you know normal, right? Also, like Spanish governor in 1599, apparently. I'm just
Yeah.
Googling this. And Ecuador had that.
Mm.
So this is, yeah. So,
At least Viserys got his golden crown, though.
yeah, I mean, it'd be a horrible way to die, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
There was a lot of a horrible way to die in the medieval era. To be fair.
Yeah, I mean, they thought of all sorts of wonderful ways to kill people.
Mm.
It was pretty horrible.
So something that as we see, and I'm gonna go a little bit back and forth in the show as well. There's a lot, of course, a lot we have to discuss here. That and something that we see, and I don't remember the battle in the Game of Thrones. I think it's season 2 and 3. I'm pretty sure that's where Joffrey has to be a general of the battle and use dragon fire in the show. And at the end, that's a resemblance to Greek fire, right? Which the Byzantines had that kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, that is without question a reference to well, not Joffrey. Yeah, I mean it was more Tyrion, right? Was doing that.
Mm,
The Battle of the Blackwater. Yeah, it's definitely a reference to Greek fire, and they use that to great effect. In the Crusades and elsewhere. It was also as an anti-ship weapon. Of course, the you know the sort of their magic Greek fire burns. Is even more horrific than the original version.
mm,
So, but yeah, it was definitely inspired by real life. Again, just stuff is really, really, really bad.
yeah.
People can do really bad stuff.
Is the battle itself an inspiration of anything, or is that just pure fiction? The battle in that
The Battle
the
of
battle I've
Blackwater.
seen, yeah.
Um, I mean, anything really, if you think about it. The storming of Constantinople. Any or the attack of Constantinople during
Mm,
was it the Fourth Crusade when the Venetians took it? But yeah, there's all sorts of I mean, especially the whole chain across the bay. It took a live inspiration from historical battles. All of them really do. Of
mm,
course, there's a lot more battles in Game of Thrones than there were in the actual Middle Ages for reasons I discussed in my book.
yeah.
Um, because medieval warfare was essentially siege warfare was very important.
Mm. No, something. I mean, you talked about this as well, and this is not Game of Thrones, but Tolkien would of course be an own episode of its own. But I think it was. And again, it's been a while since I've seen Lord of the Rings, but there is the battle in the second book, the final battle. I think it's the one where the orcs. That one is
Helm's Deep,
inspired. Pardon? Yeah,
Helm's
but
Deep, and Minas
yeah,
Tirith.
that's the one. That's the one. Yeah, that's inspired. That one was inspired by the 1453 siege of Constantinople, right?
Yeah, I do think it was in many ways. The difference is, I mean, the orcs pull up this big battering ram, right? But
Mm,
of course, they've got Gandalf, and there's Nazgul, and of course,
mm,
unlike in Constantinople, like the relief force arrives. That's what actually happens. But of course, Constantinople was not just cannon fire, but also direct siege, right?
mm.
Direct assault. So yeah,
Yeah, I just thought to mention that briefly as well. As well. I thought it was
yeah.
kind of interesting and while and sort of relatable to the episode, but. Something that I kind of thought about as we discussed this, and I wanted to bring this up, is that the Night's Watch in, I think that was the girl. It's been a while since I've seen the show now, and I do apologize for that. But the world in by the end of Westeros before the wildlings, is that kind of inspired by Hadrian's Wall? It has to be, right? It
Yeah,
has to be
yeah.
Hadrian's Wall.
He very, very clearly says it is like this whole idea of this wall at the end of the world, right? And then it's almost like a prison colony, but they really have something of like a military order about them too.
Mm,
So yeah, so they really have something like almost like a crusader order or something about them
mm,
too. So I find that really interesting
mm,
that they do that. Yeah, it's a good. He puts together a bunch of things, but it's they puts together a bunch of things, but it's very creative in a lot of
Yeah.
ways. Sorry, mind wandering again. The way he does that. Yeah, he's very yeah.
Mm. And
So
I just thought of this, and in later seasons we see Arya visiting Bravos in the Free Cities, and we will come back to the Free Cities as well, which where she meets up with this faceless gang and she trains with them. Are they kind of the assassins and Islamic sect during
yeah.
Saladin's time? Are they kind of like the assassins?
In some ways, I mean, Bravos itself really, of course, is very Venice. It really,
Mm,
smells of Venice, but the the faceless men, I mean, they're just this kind of like, they're really weird. But yeah, they do. I mean, any assassins, and they are assassins, is going to
mm,
remind us of the Hashishi, who were actually come from the a Shia sect called the Ismaili, or
mm,
the Twelvers, who did have almost millennialist beliefs about the bloodline of Muhammad and the return of the return of a descendant of Ali. Um, but they are but in this case they're a religious cult based around gods of death. So they're a cool little fantasy world, because obviously the Hashishi didn't um put on different faces, and of course
yeah,
they took their name actually from using cannabis to
yeah.
reach an ecstatic state, supposedly. um so obviously the faceless men don't do that, but they do a whole bunch of other stuff. But they are kind of like this sort of like ultra, they're kind of ninja in some way too. I mean, you got to
Mm.
say, like, okay, they're
They
also
even
like,
try to assassinate Aladdin. Sorry, not Aladdin, but Saladin at some point as well,
yeah,
right?
solid, yeah, and just a bunch of stuff like that, yeah.
Mm. So
So
and yeah, sorry, you were going to say.
yeah, that's it.
And while we're talking about Islamic history in Game of Thrones, the Daenerys, and I do not remember what they're called again. I'm sorry if I'm really poor at remembering the names sometimes, but she gets us this slave army at one point in the show.
Oh, the
Daenerys,
Enclave.
yeah, and I kind of feel like, are they inspired by the Janissaries or Mamluks? Somewhat.
um in some ways, but also I mean, I can't think of any historical eunuch armies, but certainly, in some ways, Janissaries.
Mm,
But yeah, there's definitely this sort of like vaguely. I mean, the thing is about the East, right? That in many ways, Essos is a very Orientalist creation, right?
mm,
There's an old and rather racist expression in English, the wog start in Calais, wog being an old and rather racist term for anyone not white.
yeah,
Uh, and here what they're saying basically, we're the British, we're the English, and everybody, from France on down is basically weird, some weird Easterner. And like you can even extend that sort of racism to Italy or even Spain. They're too Oriental, they're too Southern, they're
yeah.
Latin. So this whole idea of the East, right? This whole
Mm,
idea of, that's where they're eunuchs, right? They castrate people. Of course, there's a lot of
yeah.
castrate Westeros too, but this whole idea of like a eunuch army, yeah, they do sort of smell like janissaries, but also, eunuchs were um
I mean, they train
sure.
from children, right? They're castrated as children. They train from, that's all I know, the soldiers, and the same with the Janissaries, and that what was
Yeah,
supposed to be a Mamluk army, which kind of was an experiment overrun, you can say. And
yeah,
it kind of feels that they were, kind of a Janissary core of the world of Game of Thrones.
right. Yeah, well, the Mamluks certainly like this, military slavery, right? Um but they were also there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of interesting aspects to that of but the whole castration thing, right? The whole eunuchs, right? Eunuchs,
Mm,
I'm more interested in the fact that they're eunuchs than the fact that they were then they're a slave army. So they're a slave eunuch army. Nothing like that ever existed, right? No one would do
mm,
that. but there were eunuchs who were, harem guards and things like that, that they were sort of, domestic um, enslaved people um, in China, in China, in the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere.
Yeah.
And yeah, so yeah.
Yeah. And also while we are on the on the side of the free cities, there are
Hmm?
you mentioned that Brow is a kind of Venice, and the whole free cities are kind of inspired by medieval Italy, right? There are several. They are there. It wasn't united until
Yeah,
Cavour in the 19th century, and it's kind of like Venice, like you said, Bravos is, which and
yeah,
the different cities that we see, they are kind of medieval Italy, right?
yeah. Yeah, they are, and like especially like the mode of warfare of like these mercenary companies.
Mm,
So yeah, so like these mercenary, that's I find that very interesting.
mm,
Yeah, I mean, he takes a lot of inspiration, right? The whole idea of a sellsword, um, and sort of the essential disunity there, and it's funny too because they're presenting like um Westeros is maybe more unified, but really, Italy wasn't really more or less disunified than the rest of Europe, and at least in some periods, right? Some
yeah,
cases, a little more. Um, but yeah, large kingdoms started. We hindsight's 2020, and large kingdoms appeared in France and in England and Spain after Ferdinand and Isabella, right? They started more, centralized monarchies, if you would, but not so much in Italy. But it's also partially because Italy was, besides having these various dynasties that had their own city states, this traditional Italian disunity, but of course there were also, the battleground for the rest of Europe in many ways,
mm,
from this, late 15th through the 16th century and on.
yeah. And of course, we have to talk about the elephant in the room and some events of the show. And there are one I want to begin with, which I think you know which one I mean, the infamous Red
The
Wedding.
Red Wedding, right, with the
So
black dinner, right?
that's inspired by the Scottish event, the Black Diner, as you said. So let's talk about the Red Wedding for a bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
How did it take inspiration from? And that's still controversial to this day in Scotland, right? The Black Diner, it's still controversial to this day.
Yeah, yeah. No, it was a very, it was, the heads of the Douglas clan were killed, right, by James II Stuart, James II of Scotland, right? He wasn't, this
Mm,
was, well before he was crowned James II England. And I mean, sorry, James II, James II, I can look it up, but James II of England was what number of he's James VII, right? He
mm,
as of Scotland. So this is, you know, five Jameses period previously in the 15th century, come and dine with me, and then they kill him. So
mm.
yeah.
So what and Jeffrey himself, he has to be inspired by some real
Joffrey?
Jeffrey, King Jeffrey, yeah.
Yeah, Joffrey Barath. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
he has to be inspired by some monarch, right?
psycho kids. I mean, he's sort of a Caligula, really. I
Mm,
think he strikes me as like a Caligula or even a Nero. But no one was really. I mean, remember their view of Caligula and also of Nero was very influenced by Suetonius, who was a hostile later chronicler. Um, and so like we can't really know, was he really that bad, or was he just trying to, adopt sort of like an Eastern style Roman
mm,
emperorship, which didn't really take off till like really after really after Vespasian. But yeah, he's got more of a Caligula feel to me, than because I don't think any medieval monarch would have been tolerated to be so frankly, nutso and decadent, quite not quite as much. But also, there's a great deal of invention there because, well, the kid's a sociopath, right?
yeah.
So but it's for the sake of storytelling, right?
Mm. Now, something that I thought was probably worth mentioning as well is that Jon Snow in the Westeros, in the sorry in the, I don't in the North bastards, and it explains this in the book as well. He in the first book at least, the bastard would be called Snow, and then they would be called I don't something else in
Flowers
the
and
other ways.
flowers, or
Yeah,
stone.
what
Yeah.
was this like like it in the real world medieval era as well, and
Well,
pretty
they
much up
didn't
to
have.
date that bastards would be called something.
Well, you got to realize people didn't have surnames in the Middle Ages, right?
Mm,
That's more, you'd be like James, tall James, or other James, or James from across, from the other side of the river, or James Franklin, or James, from Lincoln, right? So something
mm,
like that. So the entire idea of having a surname, right, and family names, and that's it. But you got to remember, most people didn't really have surnames. If you're a well-born bastard, then you might actually have like estates settled on you, right? That people who were like, bastards, acknowledged bastards of rich people. I mean, poor people didn't necessarily need surnames. Um, and of course, you take your mother's surname in later times. If you're, or if you were married, you'd be assumed to be to your father. The woman's husband would of course be assumed to be your father, lacking paternity tests. But no, that never really happened. It's something fanciful.
mm.
I think the biggest mistake is that people think that people from the Middle Ages had
Yeah,
surnames.
yeah, and I was trying to say something. I just had it's on the tip of my tongue right now, and but I just seem to forgotten it right now. But if there is, let's end it here, I think. And before you go, is there before where would if you had a chance to live in Westeros, if where would you live if you had a chance?
Someplace with running water and soap. Probably. I don't know. I mean, could I even survive in Westeros? Do I have the knowledge? Would my knowledge be useful?
Yeah.
Would I make a living? I guess someplace where I could, survive and make a living.
Mm,
But with whatever small
mm,
skills I have. I think that a lot of people think that they'd be do very well in the Middle Ages. Oh, I'm a handy guy. I can put stuff together. But really, you wouldn't be in the Middle Ages because a lot of what you know how to do is contingent on modern technology, right?
yeah.
You can make furniture, but can you make furniture without power tools? So much of this is so much of what you know how to do
Mm,
is not suited to the medievalness.
mm. I'm reading a book as 5 volumes set on the history of Norway right now, and I'm on the 19th century, and it's a lot. I'm currently reading about diseases, and even in the 19th century, there is a lot of like diseases, a lot of it wasn't really comfortable. Children had to work from morning till evening on night shift, and you think I'm pretty sure you should be happy living in the era in the 21st century because there's a lot of things that I think we take for granted that we even if you go back a
Antibiotics.
100 years, it was still not kind of a miserable place to live in, more or less.
Yeah, antibiotics and shit, right?
Mm,
But antibiotics, safe childbirth, anesthesia. Yeah.
yeah. So I think there's a lot of things we take for granted that we have in today's world that we probably couldn't live without if we traveled back in time to the night even as far back as 19th century unless became a rich aristocrat somehow.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, we still have more material wealth, you and I as middle class
Mm,
people living in the West. Um, yeah. Yeah. People, in the West, like we actually have more wealth, more material goods than even medieval kings, just because, the productivity of our economy is so much higher.
yeah.
Yeah.
So before you go, do you have thank you so much for coming on. Do you have where can people
Yeah.
buy your book if they are interested in reading Game of Thrones and the medieval art of war, or find your website if you want me to put it in the description. Is there any links, any social media where people might find you that you want me to put it in the description?
Yeah, sure. My website's kenmondschein.com. You can follow the links, get to my books from there. My Game of Thrones book is Game of Thrones and the Medieval Art of War. And you may also be interested in my book on the history of timekeeping technology and concepts on time, published by Johns Hopkins University Press.
Thank you so much for coming on this show. It's been a pleasure to have you on and talk about real events that inspired Game of Thrones. I hope you liked this episode. If you did, check out some of the other episodes. There is plenty of episodes I'm sure you're going to find interesting. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you're on Apple iTunes, please consider leaving a review. That would help us out a lot. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. And now please like, share, and subscribe again, and I'll see you next time.